So, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We're doing a session today on accessibility within Google Workspace. And Paige is going to show us all the cool things and cool tools that we're able to use. Many of you have met Paige when she went out to visit your colleges. I want to remind you that if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A so that we're able to follow up with you. And for those of you who like to read along, click on the More button and you'll see either CC or closed caption, and then it will show up what we're saying on the bottom. Paige, I'm turning this over to you.
Righto, righto. Yes, so that is the map that I traveled across the state. Yeah, and as you see, I didn't do all of it at once. So I won't say that we did one, two, three, and it was one, two, and then three, four, and then so on and so on. So yeah, don't let that get confused. And my background, my daughter's coming home, so I realized that I probably need to put a background up. So that's why we picked that one. All right, so let's see if we got the right slide. Yep. All right. So before I begin, I want to let you know that everything you see today will be given to you as a link in at the end of the workshop, and it will also be posted in a Google Drive forever and ever. In perpetuity, I think that's the right word. Anyway, and then you will also get it probably in Sherry's email next week. But today we are going to talk about Google Workspace, specifically being docs, sheets, and slides. Now, if you are a Microsoft person, that does not leave you out of this conversation because you can still use your Google space to do many of the things that we're talking about. There are just a few things that you wouldn't be able to do. So, first thing we're going to talk about is we know that the date is coming of April 24th, 2026. We understand that, and we're trying to get all of our materials compliant. Secondly, the accessibility practices we're going to be talking about are for everything Google except forms. We're not going to talk about forms today. And then I'm also going to talk about the extension Grackle and any bonus tools that can extend what Google can do. So let's begin with finding my mouse and moving on to the next slide. So the problem with just export to PDF. Well, if you are in Google and you are trying to export to PDF, Google's native PDF export does not produce an accessible tagged PDF. There are no headings. It strips everything and is basically like starting from zero. Even if you've done all of the work, if you use that, then all of it is gone. If you download and share a PDF from Google Docs, it's likely inaccessible. The fix is going to be to use Grackle to export to an accessible PDF or share the link within Google, and then you can make sure that it is accessible. So we are trying to reach the WCAG 2.1 AA compliance standards that were set by the Department of Justice in their Title II ruling. So, and what does this apply to? Any digital content and all digital content that is shared externally and internally with students, staff, and public. So this is your sheets, your slides, and your docs. So we're going to begin with the thing that most people probably use more than anything else, and that's Google Docs. So within this, we're going to talk about heading structure, alt text, links, lists, tables, and then conversion into a PDF. So let's start with headings. Why do they matter? Headings are used to navigate by a screen reader, like a table of contents. So it's not using bigger font. It's not using bold. It's not using a specific font. It is actually using the styles that are built in through your tool. So bold is not a heading, and also you can't skip headings. All right, so I'm going to find the right window. It's always a challenge when you have a gazillion open. All right, here we are in Google Docs. And let me make sure you can see that. All right, there we go. Okay, yes. So first of all, you can see that evidently there are some headings in here because you see that little table of contents that's kind of started over there on the left. But let's take a look at this a little bit deeper. So I'm going to put my cursor right here in the middle, and I see that that is a heading 1. Okay, that's great. That means we started at the right place. And now I'm going to click here. Oh, that says normal text, but that probably should be a heading. So I'm going to make this a heading 2. Right here. Now I can move down to the next one. This is the Jedi Masters, and I'm going to actually make that a heading 3. Now I'm moving into the next section. So I'm going to actually make this back. Oh, this is a heading 2 again. But the Sith is not a heading. So let's change that to a heading 3. And also change major planets and locations to a heading 2. And then we have this key planets at a glance. I'm going to make that a 3. Lightsabers, colors, and meaning. That's, what is that? That's normal text. We're going to make that a 2. And we're going to make the Force and overview. We're going to leave that as a heading 2. So as you can see, I just briefly went through and looked at each individual section. And then I determined whether or not I felt like it needed to kind of stay nested within the section above it, or if it needed to be a new section. So each of the sections, and it doesn't matter what you see, you're going to, and I'm going to go back and show everybody one time exactly how to get to Google Docs too. So now that we've looked at this, so now let's say I want to start with a new file. So this is how I get to Google. So I'm going to go ahead here. So this may look like many of your pages that you get to when you enter through your college portal. There's a few things you can do. You can either click on Gmail or you can click on Google Drive. I'm going to use Google Drive. And when I get to Google Drive, you should come to the home. It's going to look, maybe yours is not quite as cluttered as mine, but kudos for you for cleaning better than I do. But this is where you can start. Right here it says new. This is where you can do anything new. A new folder, a new file, a new doc sheet, slide, vids, forms, etc. Every tool that you need within Google is held and found or can be located within Google Drive, which means you can launch it from there and you're going to find it. The next place, if you happen to be in your Google VCCS Gmail and you don't have yours forwarded, like I don't, you can click on the waffle, as I call it, up here at the top. And then from here, you can see I have Drive, Docs, Sheets, Slides, Sites, Forms, Vids, blah, 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 and all of the things I can find here. So that's where you can find your Google tools. I should have started with that, but it's okay. We got there anyway. But now let's go ahead and click on a Google Doc. Now I'm going to open a blank document. And I'm going to grab some text. Control A, Control C. And I'm going to put it here. Okay. And I know you didn't see all that happen at once, but that's okay. It's magic. So now I have a document that doesn't have a title, even though I copied it from a document. It's got a lot of extra gunk in here too. that I don't know about. And you can see that it appears to be a syllabus. Um, and as you can see, this is a kind of a mess, I think. If I ran Grackle on this right now, I don't even want to know what it would come up. I don't. But I'm going to go back, and the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to put in a title, maybe syllabus. Oops. Okay, so we're going to say this is the syllabus for Psych 100, and I'm going to make it a heading 1. So now I have a heading 1. I love Google because now if I go right up here to the title where it says untitled document and I simply click, Google is smart enough to actually put that title in the title of my document. Now I'm done. I don't have to worry about it. So now I can come down and I can start looking at some of these, like I think that's probably a 2. There's a lot of junky space in here. I don't know why. And you can see that there's a lot of things. I have no idea what that was. Uh, Image, I'm guessing. So there's a lot of stuff here. A fabulously horrible table that's not color contrast. So you can see that there's a lot of stuff that I would have to work with. But I could click on the extension and run Grackle, but I know what I'm looking for. So you have options in the way you want your workflow to happen. If you prefer to work through the document yourself and make the changes that are necessary, then you can do that. If you prefer to have the checker kind of tell you what you need to work on first, you can do that as well. So you can either work from the I want to fix things first and then run the checker, or run the checker and then um, decide if you want how you want to fix it or whatnot. So there's quite a few things that are obviously wrong here, whatever they are. And it says headings should be used. And obviously there's some things here that it thinks. Let's see. So now if I click locate, so that's really not a heading. That's actually a table problem. So this is the first row, and oh, that's not what I want to do at all. And I'm going to make, I will fix that in a minute, but it's all 4 of those things it thinks is the problem. But now if I go down here and look at, it appears that this table is not showing up. So that's going to be a problem. There's merged cells somewhere. Oh, I know where they are. In the in this
Oops.
table. Yep. So in that table, that's where these merged cells. Notice this high feedback was one whole merged cell, yeah. So that's got to be changed. You cannot keep that as it is. That is not accessible and it's extremely problematic. I don't, and there's a whole bunch of other weird things going on here. So I would actually have to change that out completely. But it does at least get you to see. Headers and footers, that's a suggestion, not mandatory. And the document should not contain unsupported content. So if I click on this, there is somewhere in this document a horizontal line that it doesn't like. Oh, right here. So I could just mark that as, I could clear the formatting. I could, there we go. You know, I had somebody tell me how to fix that. My brain is fried. Anyhow, there's also, notice, here's that color contrast thing that I was talking to you about. There's lots of problems here with the color contrast. Fine print, that's anything that is size smaller than an 11 is going to be pinged. And so there's a lot of blank places in here. So I could select all of those and then delete them. Oh, well, it's not liking the fact I clicked too many times. That was my fault. All caps, again, change it. You should be able to select all. And then you can make it case, sentence case, title case. And I did that all at once. So now if I wanted to do this, oh no, not that one. Fine print, select all. And I could just hit delete. Oh, that didn't work. Nope, delete's not going to work. So you can make it bigger. Of course, I'm not real sure why that's there, but okay. You get the point. So you can work through piece by piece and decide whether or not you want to add it. All right. So that is the beginning, and that's where you start. You start with headings. So moving on from headings, I want to talk about alt text. So adding alt text in Google is going to be exactly like you think. You're going to right click on the image, and then it's going to have an alt text window show up, and you're going to write a meaningful description in the field. The title of the image is optional. Now, an Acorn framework or the Acorn framework is a way for you to write the alt text so that it is meaningful to in relation to the context that surrounds it. So I'm looking at this specifically, and I see that that we're going to a bar chart showing enrollment. So if it is something like a chart or a graph, you're going to see that that's going to be very problematic if you just said chart or image. If it's just decorative, in other words, if it doesn't hold any value to the listener and it's not related to the content, then you want to make sure that you title it appropriately or mark it as simply decorative. So now let's go back to Google and back to our Star Wars. Now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to take a look at this image. So I'm going to click on the image. I'll right click and now I'm going to click alt text. And you can see that there's no alt text for that image. Now that's the Millennium Falcon traveling through hyperspace. I could write that out really easily. Iconic. Falcon traveling through, oh, except I can't spell. Hyperspace. Okay. So evidently I didn't spell that right, but that's okay. All right. Now, so now we have that's saved. So that's done. So now if I scroll down, I have this Darth Vader that's done in a different style. So do I want to describe the style? Well, that's dependent upon the context that surrounds it. If this were talking about artistic styles and using characters for whatever purpose, then I could describe it as George Seurat's Darth Vader, portrait of Darth Vader in George Seurat style painting, right? Or I could just simply say leader of the Sith, not, I should say, one of the leaders of the Sith, most famous Darth Vader. Okay, so now I have that information as well. So now if I go down here to the last image, again, it doesn't have anything that's decorative. And so what I could do here is just put double quotes. So quote, quote, or I can put alt text equals quote, quote. End quote, beginning quote, end quote. So now I have added in the information. So that's how you add alt text. You can also get generative AI to help you write a description. I could take that entire document, throw it into Gemini, and say, I need alt text for the three images that are in this file. So let's do that. So how do you get to Gemini? So again, I'm going to go back to my Google Drive. I'm going to go to the waffle. I'm going to go to Gemini here. Now, from this, I can, since that document is in my folders, I can click on the plus and I can add from my drive. And there it is. I'm going to go ahead and click insert. I'm going to say, I need alt text for the images in this document. And that's how we're going to leave it. And we'll see what happens. Now, no. So ACORN, I will remind you what that means. Accurate, concise, objective, relevant, and necessary. Now, it may tell me that that's not necessary, but it is drafting the alt text now. And so it did. No. So now you can see it's fixed the issues and it gave me, so I could have done that to begin with rather than typing in my own alt text. So you do have options, and notice that because it's in my Google Drive, I was easily, very quickly able to add it straight to Gemini and run that prompt. So now let's go back and talk about the next thing, which is descriptive links. So links need to be meaningful, just like alt text also needs to be meaningful. So if it is download the course syllabus, that's going to be way more important and descriptive and meaningful than saying, click here for the syllabus. Or just pasting in a raw URL like HTTPS colon slash backslash backslash yada blah, whatever it is. You don't want to do that. So the other thing you don't want to do is you don't want to put in lists that are not formatted as a list, whether that's bulleted or numbered or either way. So you're not going to manually type in a dash or use an asterisk or anything like that. So screen readers announce list of 5 items, but only if it has the correct formatting. So you want to make sure that you do that. So let's go back and look at our document again and see if our lists are actually lists and if our links are appropriate or not. So first one. So if I highlight this, I can see that my little bulleted list thing did not pop up to tell me that it was an actual list. So now I'm going to go ahead and click on that. Now, what I am going to say is this. So because it wasn't a list, now I am going to have to do a little cleanup here and remove the fake dashes, and so that it looks better. And now I'm going to scroll down. And now I'm going to look for descriptive links. Oh, we have a problem. Look, here's one. Let's see if we can, to learn more about the Sith, you can more read here. Okay, I don't even, so obviously those are not good. So what I could do is I could highlight them, click the link option. I could search for look at there. There's a whole fandom page. And I'm going to click on that. Now, the problem is you can see that it isn't the way it needs to be. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to click on this. I think that's what it was called. Anyhow. And again, you could read more about the force. You're going to do the same thing. Now, I could also delete this completely and click on, let's say, I wanted to search for something I wanted to add. So I want to add something from the web. Now, I'm going to add a link and I'm going to type in, see what happens. Oh, wait a minute. There's a video. Let's use that one. And notice that it already put in the link. So now I have a video, and that's how you can add in links. Again, anything that says read more, that's not an appropriate. So what I would do is find more, and then I will remove all of that styling. Oops. And then I could highlight this and put that in as a link. So all right. Now that's how we fixed links and lists in Google. Moving on. Tables. So same thing with the table. So when you are in and you're looking at tables, you're going to make sure that it either has to have a header row or a header column. And from there, you're going to, that's pretty much all you have to do. You can also caption the table, which is give it a title if you need to, but you need to keep it simple by making sure that you do not merge cells. So if I go back to my document, and I click on the table by right clicking the first row, and I go to table properties. About options, we'll try that. And you know, this does this to me every time. All right, so tables are frustrating for me in Google because I don't understand why it doesn't asks me. So the easiest way to do this is pin the header row. So if you pin the header row, now you have a header, and it makes sure that when you are checking it for accessibility, that header row is actually labeled correctly. And now, so that's kind of, and then there's one more thing we're going to check while we're here, and that's going to be color contrast. So, for example, this gray on black is not good. So I'm going to change this. I'm going to actually go to the background color, and I'm going to make it dark purple. And now I'm going to change the font color to white. And now you can see that is it's a little bit better. It's definitely a higher contrast, which is what we're looking for. We're also going to make sure that everything in this table is the right size. So if I highlight all of this and I go up here to the font, I see that because the box is empty, that tells me there are multiple font sizes. So I'm going to go here and I'm going to choose 12. And now my table is correct. So some of these, as you can see, 11 is fine. Anything smaller than that is very problematic. But for a table, I would probably try to keep it a little bit more around the 12s. So now we've done some things. So now I'm going to go to my extension. I'm going to go ahead and click on Grapple Docs and let's see what I missed, because I know I missed a few things, but I might have done that on purpose.
So I put both in the chat and in the question and answer the specific directions for launching Grackle and a reminder that you must use your at email.vccs.edu browser, not your personal one.
Correct. And I'll talk about that when I switch to the next one. All right. So there's a couple things. And this second one, I'm sure nobody even realized. The document language was not specified. So I'm going to go ahead and click on set language. And we'll wait till it opens. And here is your document properties. And I'm going to go ahead and choose English. And now I'm going to update. So now I have fixed that problem. And it's not going to automatically go away until I use the recheck. So now we have a couple other things. So now you can see that the table is still problematic. So let's see why the table is problematic. So let's open it by clicking on tag. And here is the box that I needed before that evidently wasn't going to show up. So it says mark first row as header. That's all you need to check and click update. And now that problem has also been corrected. Now the last thing is adjusted alignment, not suggested for non-heading text. I have no idea what that means. Center aligned is not recommended for normal text. I don't even know where that is. It says blank too. Huh. Okay, I don't know where that is, but I would just delete it if I could find it, but I really can't find it. Anyway, so now I could recheck this and I should only have one thing that is still problematic. Okay. Again, we still have that weird adjustment, whatever it is, center aligned text is not, I have no idea what that is. Weird. So I don't see any center line text. But anyway, okay. So that's how you run Grackle Docs. So I happen to use a browser called Wavebox, but that's because I used to have numerous Chrome browsers open on my computer and I decided to move to something different. However, regardless of what browser you use, you're going to want to sign into the browser with your VCCS. Now, how do you know that I'm signed in? Because if I click on my picture right there at the top, it tells me PED 2604. That tells me that I'm in my right account and that Grackle is going to open because my browser is associated with my email.vccs.edu account. If you are logged into your personal Gmail and you try to run Grackle, it's not going to work. So if you click on this image, or let me show you a better example. This one. Yeah. So if you look at this and you go up here to the very tip top, you're going to see my click. If I click on that, it tells me that is Page Durham. That is not the VCCS browser. And therefore, if I try to open Grackle, it's going to give me an error message because I am not logged into the correct account. You cannot be in a browser that is associated with your personal account and try to run Grackle that is associated with your VCCS account. Okay. So now that I've said that, let's move on to Sheets. So in Sheets, we're going to talk about data, table structure, sharing, and some other considerations. So why does it matter? Well, a lot of times in Sheets, there are no headers on the columns. They're merged cells, which is a nightmare. And there's color only to display meaning. And there's also empty rows, columns, or even an empty sheet. And any and all of those are problematic. So within your sheets, your row one should always be your column headers, and you should label every column very clearly. Make sure you freeze the header row as well, and then do not use merged cells for a visual layout. It breaks a screen reader. Instead, you can use a dedicated row and leave the cells unmerged, and then you can merge across the cells if you need to make it pretty. Delete any empty rows or columns that are only being used for any kind of visual spacing. The next thing is color. Do not use color as the only indicator of meaning. So if you put notes in cells, make sure you use insert note to add a context to a cell. That way it is read by a screen reader. Now, for complex sheets, make sure you export the key so that it is, or a summary, so that it is a little bit easier to understand. So you can add a text column or a symbol along for the coding, but you cannot just use color to convey meaning. All right, so now let's take a look at a Google Sheet. All right, so first problem that we have is that whole mess right there is a merged cell. And then there's a blank row here. So let's get rid of that. That's the first thing we're going to do. Now, this is slightly problematic because it says active, but what does green mean, right? So there has to be meaning to this. I need to move this up just a second. And there's also, or does it relate to something else? Now, so I've moved that. Now, the other issue, you can see that we have a second sheet. And again, we have merged cells across here. And we have color, that's horrible, I might add, that is not contrasting enough when you're looking at it. The last thing is, this is actually how the first sheet should have looked. So if I go here and you see that Fleet Inventory Rebel it's one, but it still shows fine. If I wanted to, I can highlight and then I could well, you should be able, I don't know why I did that. You should be able to merge across cells. But you can see that if I double click, that just makes it bigger, but we're gonna scoot that. All right, so now the other thing is you can freeze the rows by going to view, and then you can freeze. You can freeze one row or two rows. That's pretty much it. Or you can freeze one or two columns. You can't freeze any more than that. It just doesn't let you. So now let's look back here again. And now I'm going to go to my extension and I'm going to go to Grackle Sheets and I'll go ahead and I'll launch that. Now, I know what it's going to find because I've kind of already told you. They're missing headers, they're merged cells, there's color only meaning, and you're going to be able to fix those things within the Grackle platform. So here we have the sheet need a title, that's fine. They're descriptive. There should be reasonable. Tables have headers. Now you can see already that this is problematic because table A1, okay, that table does not have a header. So the problem is the header row is actually the second one. So it's not really sure what it wants. And this again, is this the correct one or is it not? So and I could mark these with a header row. And now the last thing is high color contrast should be used. So we're going to take a look at that as soon as it's finished spinning. So if I go at cell F3 on sheet 1, it's this green on white. So a couple things. I could click up here and I could make this a different color green, and that's going to actually fix the issue. And I can do the same thing, and then I can click on the yellow. And again, I want to make this a very dark color. And that's how you can fix those issues. And I'm just kind of cheating. So, and notice that I could have converted this. It's very happy to do this for me to a drop-down chip. But now I could, as you can see, I could recheck this. And it should have fixed most things. Okay, so the color contrast issue is fixed. The tables are fixed. The use of merged cells, not fixed. Unmerge. And avoid isolated cells on sheet 3. This sheet is this isolated. This is what it means. So I could just move that up to there. And now I fixed the problem. So isolated means that it's kind of hanging out there in Never Never Land. And so that's what that is. So here it is. That is not an isolated cell. I moved that. Now, if you notice, I also got the convert to table option. So if I go back here and I click, should convert to a table. It does allow you to convert it to a table so that it has that header, and then it provides you with some themes and things like that. But I'm not going to spend any more time on that. So download to HTML is the option that you have. However, if you need it as a PDF, you can do that as well. But what I would do is keep it as an Excel spreadsheet. I would not necessarily convert this to a PDF unless you absolutely had to. But you can also put HTML in your Google Drive and it will open correctly. All right, so in the last 15 minutes, I've already talked about all of this, so I'm going to whiz through these slides. And now I'm going to talk about slides. So slide titles, reading order, alt text, presentation, accessibility. Every slide has to have a title. If you don't want to see the title, you can hide it by dragging it above the slide. And then don't delete the title placeholder on each slide. You can move it, hide it, but don't delete it. And the reason that a slide has to have a title is, again, it's about how the screen reader navigates. So if you have 3 slides with the same title on every slide, but the student only wants to find the information that's on the second one, they're going to have to listen to 3 of those again because they can't find that second slide because they have the same title. So that's why you want to have those. Reading order is based on how the slide was built. You're going to check it and then you're going to fix it. Alt text and decorative images and slides, exact same thing that you did in Google Docs. You're going to actually use alt text to fix them. And then again, you can run Grackle slides and it's going to show you missing slide titles, alt text, color contrast, reading order, and link text. So, and in other words, your links must be descriptive. All right. So let's go back and now let's look at a slides presentation. All right, so here we have assume a title slide and a guide to the galaxy far away. We have an image, Another image. I guarantee you these don't have alt text. Um, and hopefully you all understand the problem here. If you can't see what color that is, it's going to read box used by Jedi Guardians, box used by Jedi Consulars, box used by the Sith. So color is being used here to convey meaning with nothing else. Han Solo, guarantee you he doesn't have a picture. I did that on purpose for those of you that were laughing. Here we have some click here links that are not so hot. And I guarantee you that image doesn't have alt text. So let's start, and we're going to go ahead and we're going to launch Grackle. Also, if you are running Grackle, at the very bottom, you know you're in the right version if you see Grackle Slides subscribed. As long as you see subscribed, you know you are in the correct VCCS account and your Grackle is free for you to use. I didn't think it would take this long, but okay. Well, you know what? I'm impatient. Not that anybody's ever called me that before, but all right, here we go, launch. Try again. Reboot's always my favorite thing. All right, I'm going to get back up here for a second. So I'm pretty sure we have. Now, here's the difference. You can't add a title to a slide if you've deleted it. So what I would have to do, let's just say that I needed a slide title. I can go to slide, new, and I could apply a layout. Obviously there's no layout. So I'm just going to click new and notice that the slide is completely blank. There is no title here. So the problem with that is that the theme that I used didn't have any slide titles included. So let's go back to the beginning. So here we go. Presentation title is required. Oh, imagine that. No title block found in any slide. So Star Wars slide demo. Yep. American English. Yep. Okay, update. So now I have taken the title that's up here. I could probably change that. And added that to the presentation. Now, as you can see, none of the slides have a title. So we're going to go ahead and click on slide. Come on now.
Pages you're waiting to click.
Impatient.
If
Yes.
I've created my slide deck in Google Slides, I've done the Grackle, everything is perfect. Can I now save it as a PowerPoint and will it still be accessible?
Not necessarily. You're still going to have to run the PowerPoint accessibility check because sometimes the fonts and the structure does not. I don't think so. If you want my honest answer, I would not do that. I would save it as a PDF maybe, but I would not convert it to a PowerPoint.
And if I save my Google Doc or my Google PDF, or if I save my Google Doc or my Google Slide as a PDF from Google, that will keep my tags?
Yes,
Thank you.
as long as you're using Grackle to do it.
Yeah. That was the intent. The person said they wanted to go through Grackle.
Yes, but keep it as a Google and do not convert it to something other than what you see in Grackle, which is export to PDF.
Oh, I got you. Thank you.
Yep. So keep it in Google, put the link out, but if you want to give your students a copy of it, then use the export to PDF from Grackle, and then they can have the live version, which they can't edit anyway, and the saved version. So interesting that yeah. So you can see that there are some templates that you can use. But what I am looking for, you can see there is no theme here, which is very problematic. And I did this on purpose. So what I could do is I'm going to show you, this is how I would totally cheat. So I'm going to click File, New, Presentation. And you see this ginormous box right here. I'm going to click Control C, and then I'm going to go right back to Star Wars. And I'm going to close this mess. And I'm going to go back here and I'm going to paste that in. And right here, it says keep source formatting. That is exactly what you want to do. So you're going to keep that source formatting. And then you can, if I wanted to, I can I got to make this smaller. Move the title up here. That would be hiding it, as I said to you before. If I wanted to, and that way I could put the title in. Except I can't spell. Oh, I really can't spell. And then now that slide has a title. Now the problem is I can't make that a title. I'd like to, I don't know why I can't, but that's not for me to figure out right now. We're just going to go on with it. So that is the problem. So if you want a title on any of these slides, you have to have one and create it. You're going to have to, but you may have to take it from another slide. So I could do the same thing here, go back here, and then make sure that I leave keep source formatting. And again, I could take this information, Control C, Control V. It's a little bit of a hassle, but now I have a title. So I just copied the information from, and notice that these two slides have the same title. So what I could do here, what I would do now that I've gotten this here, I'm going to Control C this, and I'm going to delete this and put that in, and then I'm going to put a little V2 next to it. And now that has a different title. And so that these are same title, but at least there's a difference between the two, so that if somebody only wants to read about the notable Jedi Masters, they don't have to go through whatever was on the first slide. So now we look at this. So now we have to figure out, what are we going to do with this? So what I can do is from here, you could put in alt text, and I would say blue. And I would say, again, alt text. Why did it not work? There we go. Bring. And red. I don't know why it's making me do that, but you get the idea. And that's all they need to know, because that color is what is associated with the rest of that information, which you can't see because I made it too small. There we go. Now it's bigger. All right, for the last few minutes, I want to make sure that I cover just a few extra bonus things. I always like to throw in a little extra spice, because that's the variety is what we live by, right? So bonus Google extensions that you may want to look into. First one is Autocrat. So it's a mail merge for Google. What does it do? What it does, it takes anything from a Google Sheet and merges it into a template, generating individualized, personalized documents. So if you had, for example, students filling out a Google form that was being filtered into a Google Sheet, and then you wanted to give them a copy of what they gave you and a template, then you could use Autocrat, which is an extension. Now, the caveat with this is any of the output documents are only as accessible as the template that you create. So you have to make sure that you build your template in Google Doc with proper headings, alt text, and structure first before you run Grackle, and then before you add it to Autocrat. And you can find that in the Google Workspace Marketplace. So finally, the last few things you want to look for. Your Grackle Suite is already included in all of your VCCS things. Equatio is one you might want to look into if you teach math or STEM. Docs for editors voice typing, that's built in, so you can actually use voice typing while you're building out your documents. Google Forms are already more accessible than a fillable PDF. Just know that it doesn't have Grackle, so it's kind of you have to understand how to build the form. Lucidchart is available for diagram creation with alt text support, and it integrates directly into Google Docs. And then Read and Write for Google, which is a support. You can recommend that to students for some support. So in your Google Accessibility Workspace, hopefully you understand that whether or not you're creating a Word document, a PDF, a Word document, a sheet, or a slide, you're going to make sure that you use proper headings, alt text, descriptive links, color contrast. That's a huge one for slides. Then you're going to run Grackle on everything that you have in Google, and you're going to make sure that you are logged into your email.vccs.edu account. And then you're going to export to PDF through Grackle. And then you can use Autocrat or some other tools if you want. And I would highly suggest that you look in the Google Workspace. There are tools that come out all the time that are helpful for many, many, many different things. So the last thing before I move on, because I did skip something that I meant to talk about, is reading order. And I can't believe Sherry let me actually skip that, but we're going to look at this slide. Okay, so we have Han Solo. So I'm going to go back and I'm going to open Grackle again. Oh, there we go. And I'm actually looking at the slide structure. So we're going to hop over here. Notice that all of these ellipses are here, in case you didn't see that. Those are I'm pretty sure those are the dots. So all of those dots are marked because they are not in the background. So that's what you're seeing there. So I thought that's always fun. Now let's go to slide 5. So the first thing that somebody's going to see is the most important lesson: always let the Wookiee win. So that's problematic. So now we're going to reorder this, and we have to drag things around because, and the image, I don't even know where that is. Oh, it's around him. I could just mark this as decorative. It's going to say artifact. I'll show you. So mark as artifact, and then I can update that. So the yellow box is what it was asking about. And so that's how you would do that. So you can see that for Google Slides, your slide structure is going to be where you're going to find out if things are actually looking like the way it should. And if not, again, you can fix the things that are here and this is not the speediest of tools, but it does work. So before I didn't want to leave that because I was like, wait, I totally forgot that. So if you have questions, I will be in open lab. And if you need anything else or you're looking for help, please feel free to reach out. I'm sorry, I'm staring under my computer because I can't find the share button. All right, so I don't want to keep anybody late. So let me put the links to the important things in chat. So that is a link to the presentation. This is a link to the document. This is a link to my website. And I think I think I got all of that. And on the there's a couple other things. The one other thing is if you are running into trouble with Grackle in the slide deck, there is an entire slide on using Grackle requirements and troubleshooting. You can find a guide, but you have to be logged into your VCCS account in order to find that guide on how to make sure that your Grackle is let me put that in here too. There you go. And that is your helper article or your guide for Grackle that is on the VCCS website. So there's also links to all of those things in the presentation, as well as my contact information. And if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. And it is 6:03, and so I am going to stop.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank all of you for being here this evening. Our students and our colleagues appreciate as we make our things more accessible. Rising waters floats all boats. It actually helps all our students. When we send out the Tech Tip Tuesdays, you will get all the links. Have a very good night. Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.